Hi, I'm Lucia Dewey Atwood with the Eames Foundation, sharing the works of Charles and Ray Eames. And you are listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. George Smart cashed in a few frequent flyer miles to report from New York City, exploring the innovatively designed COOKFOX architecture office with project leader Bethany Borel. Later on, George visits author Anthony Alofsin, whose new book, Wright and New York, The Making of America's Architect, explores Frank Lloyd Wright's years in the Big Apple. Support for U.S. Modernist Radio comes from Nichiha.com/U.S. Modernist and from modernist realtor Angela Roll.
Beauty, love, durability, designed to last for years to come, bringing you peace and tranquility. You feel relaxed, knowing your house can easily achieve any exterior look and any color. Wood, concrete. Your house loves feeling this good, and you love feeling this good. Nichiha, 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 Nichiha. Say it with me. Nichiha. Advanced engineering. Nichiha, Nichiha. Durability, textures, finishes, and colors. Visit Nichiha.com/US Modernist. Nichiha, Nichiha, Nichiha. That's N-I-C-H. Wait for it. A look you'll love. Nichiha.
COOKFOX is an architecture firm on the 17th floor of a building on 57th Street in New York. You might know them from their Bank of America building in New York's Bryant Park, one of the highest designation sustainable skyscrapers in the U.S. Bethany Borel led the design of the firm's own innovative and award-winning modern office space, which took a floor of an old automotive company and turned it into a compelling, sustainable workplace. It's not your usual corporate sea of lifeless cubes.
No.
There are plants and rocks and birds and things. There's sand and hills and rings. And
we've been through the desert on a horse with no name. It felt good to be out of the rain. Oh. Sorry, that's terrible, isn't it? Terrible, terrible, terrible. All that plant life channeled that old America tune, which most people think was Neil Young, but was not.
I was on the radio when that song first came out, and I was sure.
Everybody thought so, right?
I've been through the desert on a horse with no name.
I think that's Eileen Ryan of the Beverly Hillbillies singing that tune. Okay, back to COOKFOX's amazing office. There's a small farming plot there as part of 2 terraces, a cafe, excellent coffee, and really incredible views. I'm George Smart. As this is a podcast, we can't show you the views. In fact, it's a real challenge to describe things in an audio-only format. So let's segue to TV political drama where nothing beats The West Wing, except perhaps a Danish TV show called Borgen, which I discussed recently with podcast guest and documentary producer Lena Borch Hansen. West Wing, although no longer on the air, was, among many praises, known for the walk and talk, producer Aaron Sorkin's way of driving the plot forward by following White House staffers as they have spirited conversations in the White House. It's great fun to watch on TV and even more fun to do in real life. I got to do the walk and talk with Bethany Borel of COOKFOX. We even got to go outside twice which is not easy to do 17 floors up. Architect Bethany Borel grew up in Tokyo, Japan, and rural Iowa. She frequently speaks on high-performance design and teaches sustainability at the New York School of Interior Design. Her work has been featured in Interior Design Magazine, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal.
Let's go now to George talking with COOKFOX's Bethany Borel, starting in the lobby of 250 West 57th Street in New York.
So, Bethany, where are we?
We're on 57th Street between 8th and Broadway in Manhattan, which actually used to be known as Automobile Row, 57th Street, as it goes over.
Like Ford and Chrysler?
Yeah. So the GM building is around here, just across the street, and we've got some other companies that we can see better off of the East Terrace. So I'll point those out when we're out there.
Okay.
So this building used to be the Fisk Tire Building.
Fisk, are they still around or are they gone?
They've been bought out, but back then they made rubber for tires, and so this was the Fisk building.
Okay.
It was built in 1921 by Curie and Hastings, same architects as the New York Public Library and the Frick Collection and some really iconic architecture in New York. So this double height space that we're in right now used to be where they would have automobiles for show. So there are these really beautiful, amazing historic images of 1920s automobiles down here in this lobby. It's kind of hard to imagine now, but...
This was the go-go years before the Depression, right?
Right.
When everything was just, wonderful.
Yes, wonderful, yes.
So when did your organization get involved in the building?
So we moved in here about 2.5 years ago.
Okay.
Our renovation, we took the 17th floor, which is the first setback of the building. Buildings of the 1920s will have, these setbacks because there's this importance for humans to have light and air even on the streetscape, shapes the cityscape. So we took the 17th floor, which is the first setback, so that we could have terraces. So there's this infrastructure that even though these setbacks weren't originally meant for plantscape, they did provide that opportunity now as we're able to kind of come in and reinforce and
what were they originally meant for?
So they were meant for light and air to be able to get down to the streetscape, and also about the structural capacity at the time of building for load transfer for the heights of buildings that were being constructed.
Well, that sounds very engineering, but what did people do? They just go have lunch out on them? Or
No, not occupiable. People
really?
would just look out at a tar roof.
Yeah. No use at all.
No use at all until we came in and we planted them. Yeah.
Okay.
We saw an opportunity there. Absolutely.
Now, when I think of a typical architect's office, I go back to my dad's office, who had these long rows of drafting tables, and they had those kind of antique, flat, fluorescent lights with the one button on top that kind of angled over to you, and those electric erasers that would spin around the table.
Yep.
And I think most people, because you see it in the movies,
right?
You see all these rows of desks, and anything else about the office was kind of an afterthought. Like the bathrooms were just sort of like the bathrooms you see in an insurance company, or the break room, or where you got your coffee, if there was even coffee at all.
The space was a machine.
Yeah.
For people to work in.
Yeah.
It wasn't anything extra.
And people back then and now, architects work hard. I mean, they spend a lot of time.
They spend a lot of time in that space.
in these offices, right? I guess that's a holdover from going to school where you're in studio.
Yes.
All the time.
All the time.
So now you're in the office.
They train us that way, yes.
I see. How did your firm start reinventing the architect's office space? How did you start thinking about making it better for the lives of the people who have to work there?
Yeah, it's a great question. Our firm focuses on sustainable building practices, sustainable architecture, which is kind of a umbrella term right now for a lot of things. But for us, it means healthy buildings in their context, in their environment, in their urban setting, but also healthy buildings for the people that are occupying them. And so we have found that it's really important to make sure that not only are we thinking about the structure and the materiality of the architecture itself, but also the filtration levels of air, water, material content for what people are breathing in inside. So starting from that vantage point, thinking through how to make sure that we are providing the healthiest working environment for our own employees was our number one goal when we started our company.
Now, 10 years ago, there was a lot of press about unhealthy workspaces. You know, you could get some kind of toxic poisoning or air radon, whatever. I mean, what are some of those ills that are out there in office spaces that we have to look out for?
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of it is unseen, and so you won't know that there's something wrong until it's way too late. The things that we're finding right now. I know, not to be doom and gloom about it, but it's good to have awareness. And the way that we think about it is, as soon as we know this, we can't unknow it. And so, unfortunately, fortunately, actually, we now measure everything up against all of these kind of criteria that we've learned. A big one is adhesives.
Adhesives like glue?
Glue inside of what's holding your furniture together. That's a big thing. There's off-gassing. So some of those adhesives are toxic. When they come in, it's like the new car smell.
Well, wait a second. So the chair I'm sitting in is poisoning me?
It could. Not necessarily. It could be.
Maybe.
The
glue, really?
Yeah. And other things like the filtration levels of your air coming into the space, how highly they're filtered coming from outdoor air. It also depends on your environment, your context where you are. We're in New York, and so we have pretty high filtration of the air that's coming from the outside in and serving our interior environment. Okay.
Now, I thought the argument was, let's get the wild, natural, fresh air into buildings, but you have to filter it.
Yeah, well, depending on where, if you think about the air quality in Beijing versus the air quality in Colorado
Beijing
versus the air quality here in New York, there are very different contexts of air quality. So understanding where in the world we are absolutely affects the amount of filtration that has to happen. But, there are days when there's fresh air and there are days when there's a smog alert, and a big part of monitoring real time that we have available to us now is knowing what the air quality is outside, so we know, is it a good day to open the window? Usually in New York it is. But
so what happened? Does a klaxon go off and then everyone goes to the doors and windows and opens them up and said, this is a good day?
It's not quite that extreme, but in some parts of the world it is. In some parts of the world it is. Yeah. You're not supposed to open the window because, the filtration coming in will be much, much better than anything that will come in through an open window. So in New York, we're pretty blessed that we have some pretty, reliably good air coming through. But on the days when there is a smog alert, we make sure that there's no one opening the window.
You hermetically seal the building. There's just like a space capsule.
Skin drops down and nobody can open the windows.
Right.
Not quite, but yeah.
So we are now, if you can visualize this, we are now in the lobby of the former Fisk building. And we're going to go up here. So let's walk over and press the up button. First, for radio, you're going to hear an elevator excursion on the air. Here we go, right inside. You can hear the sound change once we get in here. And now we're flashing the ID badge.
Going up. Still a work in progress.
Yeah, going up.
Going up.
So I'm used to going up in buildings all over the country, and you get to the top, and generally you get there, and there's just like a wall in front of you that is a directory. It says like A company left, B company right. When we get up to your company, it's a little different. Yeah. Let's see what happens when these doors open. So I am now looking down this long hall, and I'm going to let her explain it because she's much better at this, but I'm going to give you the the amateur version. So there's some really interesting large terrariums in the middle of the hall that's on a raised, it looks like a bookshelf, but it's really not. It's a table. And then there's artwork on either side on these white walls, and it extends through to what looks like a very comfortable common area down here. But I get the sense now that I've kind of arrived somewhere. Is that what you tried to do?
Absolutely. Context and orientation are key for people to feel comfortable in a space. And so it is disorienting to come off of 57th Street in the middle of a building and to then be dropped off on a full floor plate that is not square. One really important thing for us is that as soon as you get off of the elevators, you see green, that there's a connection. There's not only the understanding of where you are oriented in space, but also that there's a visual connection with nature as soon as you come off of the elevator bank. So one of those strategies was what we did with this entry gallery. So this hallway that we call our gallery is actually the overrun for the low-rise elevators.
What does that mean in real terms?
So there are some elevators that only go to the 16th floor.
Okay.
We are on the 17th floor. So there are low stack elevators, low rise elevators that serve only those lower spaces.
Oh, I see.
And we are part of the high rise elevators. So we're basically the first stop on the elevators going up. Yep. We have this gallery space that provides a moment of decompression, of calm. 57th Street is very busy. It's very hectic. We're right by Central Park. There's a lot of tourism here, a lot of visitors. And so we thought it was really important to have this 20-foot long by 12-foot wide oriented walking scape before you get to our reception desk.
And the reception area is, again, that much bigger. So you really got, what, 40 feet view here, 50 feet
It's
across?
nominally about like 35 feet.
Okay.
Yeah, down that way. We also have one window that faces east here. And if you come over to it for a second, you can see our terrace. So even though you don't necessarily come over here when you come right off of the elevator, when you're waiting for the elevator and you look back, you'll be able to see our corn, our hydroponic towers, the greenscape, but also to see the horizon and to see what's happening weather-wise outside. These are really important orienting factors for our psychology to feel comfortable and not disoriented.
It's a beautiful view of all these buildings here.
It's a really interesting part of town because we've got this really rich history of Automobile Row and a lot of these buildings that were built in the early 1920s and 1930s. And then now you have these skyscrapers. So some of the tallest towers, residential towers in New York City, you can see from this view too. So it's a very layered, rich view.
Now, what is this giant terrace down below?
That's for the residential building that's right next door.
Okay.
Yeah, that's not usable.
That is a big space. Did they ever put people out there? Or is it one of those things like
haven't
back in the 20s that they didn't let people out on their terrace?
Yeah, no, it's there as a setback, and so it's not used by them.
Non-functional terraces. So now we're walking down this hallway.
One thing I'll point out is the table that you mentioned looks like a bookshelf.
Yes.
It's made from ambrosia, which is a type of maple. And
I did not know that. I thought you ate it at like holiday dinners.
Similar. Jello-based.
Yeah, Jello-based
from
food.
the Midwest, so I know a lot about ambrosia salad. But the ambrosia wood is it's a spalted maple. And so it has this really rich, complex texture to it. And what I've noticed is as people walk into our space down this 20-foot corridor, hallway, gallery area, people run their hands along it. There's something that, subconsciously we want to connect with a natural material.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then the terrariums, they're actually on loan from an artist named Paula Hayes.
Okay.
So she cultivated these for us specifically for the lighting conditions here. You notice we don't have any daylight in this gallery itself. Now that we've transitioned out of the elevator lobby into the gallery, we don't have any actual natural light. So these are all plants that will be able to thrive in the lighting conditions that we have here, which is the artificial light.
And tell me about, these lights look like they're not something I can just pick up at the Home Depot. They look like there's some sort of special lighting for here.
They're track lights. You can pick them up at just a hardware store. We were very intentional about how the conduit and everything, all of the bits and pieces that feed it to make it work are curated so that they start to disappear. But the most important thing for us here was that we exposed the original structure of the underside of the floor above. So you see this grit, this history, this what we lovingly call goulash of the construction methodology for how this building was made back in 1921.
Is that a Hungarian reference or just a food reference?
I must be hungry today with the ambrosia and the goulash.
Okay. So now we're here in the reception area, and I'm looking to the right and I'm looking to the left, and I don't see a single giant drawing board like in the old days. I see CAD. I see CAD stations everywhere, which has been around, I guess, since late 80s, early 90s, roughly. We were talking earlier about in the 60s and 70s, they invented these things called drafting machines, which would attach to your drafting board, and it had a big knob and an L shape. And it would come down, it would make the perfect right angle, or you could adjust it to make different kinds of shapes. And all of the old school architects thought this was really cheating in the design process.
Took the art out of it.
Took the art out of it, just like people complained when CAD came along in the 90s that all the art was going to go away. But it hasn't, obviously.
It hasn't.
And in fact now, because of computers, you can do things that were unimaginable before because of the computing power of all that.
Absolutely. And now we've got Revit and we've got CATIA and we've got scripting programs and all of these that push it to the limit, but they're all just tools. And that's how we have to think about it. Your hand is a tool, the computer is a tool, all of these softwares are tools, but the end result, the end goal is not to be driven by the software that we're using. It's from the creative space in our mind.
Right.
So that's what we remind our
Now, the first thing I
staff.
notice about the office, just boom, is that plants everywhere. I don't think there was a single plant in my dad's office, except maybe in the lobby, and it was plastic. But these are real, I assume, all of them.
You won't find a plastic plant here, no. As you mentioned when we first got to this reception area, there's a clear path, a view path to each of our terraces, those setbacks that I was mentioning because of our 17th floor location. So that also helps to orient your context in space, seeing nature and daylight. Though it's the full floor plate to be able to see through to the west terrace, we do have plantings throughout that help to kind of pull your eye over to that western side.
Yeah, I mean, it's really cool to see, and you've got all different kinds of plants here, too.
We do.
I think I see some cacti
We do
in
have
there,
some cacti.
and
We have some bigger ones on the west.
Things.
We face north here, and so we get a lot of reflected light from the glass building across the street.
It's not like one of those buildings that like sends lasers and burns your desk or something
It doesn't
like
burn
that.
our desk, but we do have to drop the shades when the sun hits about 4 o'clock this season. Yeah, but we have these planters that are oriented on each spine of our desk. All of our workstations are oriented along that north facade because of the windows there, and we have a thin viewing garden along there, so that everybody has access to daylight and a view of nature. But those pods have intermittent spines between them that have movable planters on them that help to kind of mitigate acoustics. So the height of our partitions for our workstations are very specific. We're an open office space because that's how we work best, but acoustics are the biggest problem with open office spaces. So having the availability for people to adjust those planters if their neighbor is a little bit too loud, or if they want to talk to their neighbor, they have that opportunity. But it is an organic element that is being moved around and not just bookshelves.
So where should we go first?
Let's go over to the harvest gathering space. So when we go east from the reception desk, we're in this large open space. It's the original concrete floor of the building. We stripped back the ceiling to its beams and girders, so you really see the structure in this space. And
I feel like I'm in Starbucks now. I'm in
you
sort
do?
of a cafe area.
Is that a good thing?
It is. It's a very good thing, of course.
Yeah, this area is for kind of community involvement. So people sit at this harvest table and have lunch every day, and we often clear this space out and have guest speakers come. And it's a good amount of square footage to not have workstations.
Right.
But because of the open office space, there needs to be a few alternative working areas and kind of release valves for people. So this area serves a bunch of purposes. So there's that kind of informal meeting. There's the gathering when there's guest lecture. So every morning our studio meets and talks first thing in the morning on Mondays about the status of all of our projects. So it's
like Hill Street Blues used to do, where they gather all the cops together and do the briefing in the morning.
Exactly, yes.
At the end, do you all say, now be careful out there?
Yes, we will now. But we have this kitchen area here that's open to the harvest gathering space. And we set this up so that clients and employees and visitors, everybody feels equally comfortable coming and grabbing a cup of coffee or a seltzer or sitting and working for a little bit before the meeting starts. All of this has been set up to be informal meeting space. And although, at 10:30 in the morning, people have already had their coffee and are at their desks, at about 11 o'clock, it starts to fill up. So it's interesting to see the waves of people as they come in and out of this area.
And adjacent to this, I see you've got some actual conference room type.
The geometry of this floor plate is very interesting because we have Broadway on our east that cuts at an angle through Manhattan. And so there's this angle to our space that is carved by Broadway. And so we set up our conference rooms, a few kind of select-sized conference rooms for this area to help mitigate that interesting geometry.
Yeah.
So we have one of our larger conference rooms here at the northeast, and then we've got a smaller one that's for a more intimate meeting space that is more acoustically sound for more private meetings here too.
Okay. So that you don't overhear what's going on in that one.
It's very important.
That's the super secret meeting
Super
room.
secret
Yes,
meeting room.
okay.
Yes, exactly.
Well, let's go outside here and see one of these terraces,
Absolutely.
because I'm just fascinated by the fact that people were not using these things until you took them over. This is beautiful out here.
This is our east terrace. So this is our gardening terrace. We have our aquaponic towers. We have our garden beds where we grow corn in the summertime, beans, squash. We use the Three Sisters method of planting herbs, teas, all sorts of things. So this area on the east side was set up as really kind of urban farming for us. Yes. Yep. And we have our apiaries over here too that are a little sleepy now in December. They're hibernating, but in the summertime they are pollinating.
For those of you that don't know what apiary is, it's a
beehive.
It's a beehive. Yeah.
Yes, we have two, and we have Italian honeybees. I'm not going to pretend like I know a ton about bees because I'm not one of the beekeepers, but we have architects on staff who are beekeepers.
Is there something special about Italian honeybees versus other kinds?
I hear they're much friendlier.
Oh, really?
So they're quite
they don't sting
quite
you
docile.
as much, right? Wow.
So they produced about 170 pounds of honey last season. So they're pretty busy.
And how many pounds of produce does this plot produce approximately?
That's a good question. We don't measure it in poundage, but we do have ample amounts of greenery to the point where we often in the summertime, when it's kind of full-fledged towards the end of the summer, we'll get daily emails about please come and harvest the kale, please come and help yourself to all of these greens because there's too much.
Now, I'm sure you've thought of this, but have you had like a farm-to-table dinner, given that the distance here is about 10 feet?
Yes, we have. And that's part of why we set it up this way. Oftentimes, we'll have morning meetings and we'll harvest some of the greens from this space and create smoothies or salads, or we'll often have lunches at the harvest table that include food that we've harvested from our garden.
Oh my God, yes. This is great.
We also have our composter over in the corner.
Okay.
So we've got some kind of full circle, whatever we can. We produce so much compost that we do integrate it into our planting beds, but we also donate it at some of the farmers markets around here.
And what are those little devices over there?
The tall white towers that look kind of spiky.
Yeah.
Yeah. Those,
birdhouses, I'm guessing?
They're aquaponic towers.
Aquaponic.
Yeah. So they grow. They're actually our major producer of greens, not our flatbeds, but these aquaponic towers.
Okay.
So they cycle water through that vertical element, and so it's a soil-less growing system.
Oh, okay. That's really cool. And they turn out a big volume, I guess.
Yes. It's an understatement. A significant amount, yeah, to the point where you don't even see the armature anymore once they're in full bloom with all of the greens. All you see is this almost Muppet-like green vertical. It's beautiful.
Wow. So we are looking, what is this giant building that's being constructed here?
So the one right here on the corner, this is the Nordstrom Tower. So that's a residential building that is affiliated with the Nordstrom store that just opened on Broadway.
Okay.
Yep. And then we've got another residential building right there that has gone up in the past 2 years. And this building that's kind of bluish color has been there for a little bit, but beyond that is another residential tower that's going up that's called the Shard.
Oh. Huge. There's so much construction here in New York.
Significant amount, yes. The landscape is constantly changing.
All right, well, let's go back in and walk down the other end. So you went to, they call it RISD, right?
I went to Pratt. I went to RISD for a pre-college program for graphic design when I thought I wanted to be a graphic designer. And then I did some soul searching and decided I wanted to be in interior design and architecture. So I did my undergraduate at Pratt, and then I got my master's in architecture at Columbia.
At Columbia, okay. And then what happened?
And then I started working. No, I worked for a bit between undergrad and grad school. But I've always been in and around New York City. I grew up moving around a bit. My family is originally from the Midwest, but I grew up in Tokyo and kind of dense urban settings.
Yes, you were in Iowa, right?
My parents are from Iowa.
Iowa.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Did you ever go to the Field of Dreams and see that?
No, I haven't. No.
I have always wanted to do that.
Yeah, on your bucket list?
I know. It's been 30 years now since that movie, and I still have not made it to Iowa.
I believe it'll happen. So as we've walked through the studio, you've probably noticed it's a pretty quiet setting.
Yeah.
And part of that is because we're a quiet culture, but we also chose very specific materials that have sound-absorbing qualities. So our carpet tile has a foam backing, so there's no footfall noise, which is really important.
Foam backing. Who'd have thought?
Who'd have thought?
Sounds simple.
It's very simple. It's not a raised floor system, so we put it directly on the concrete that's there. It's also better for your joints when you're walking on it.
Yeah, like a gym floor, sort of.
Similar, yeah. We also have all of our pinup board at our desks is actually an acoustic panel. So any of the noise that you are creating by being on the phone or talking to your coworker is mitigated by that. And so a lot of these materials were very specifically curated to start to help mitigate some of that noise transfer from an open office environment.
Now, what do people do for privacy here? How do they, go make the phone call to their broker or, their girlfriend or something like that?
Yeah, we have some phone booths around. So private rooms that are really single occupancy that, again, are lined in acoustic material so they can have a private conversation and tuck away outside of the normal workspace. And so we have a few along here so that people, when they get that call, can duck in pretty quickly.
Okay. So do you have anybody that ever just hides out in there and never emerges?
Not that I've noticed yet.
I hear that in other office layouts, that there's always somebody that wants to hide in the phone booth all day.
Well, architects are usually introverts, so I believe that. Ours have a translucent water patterned glass, and so it's not 100% visually private.
Okay.
So people would notice if you're sitting there all day.
I see.
Likely
hogging the
get
phone
confused.
Booth.
Yeah.
Okay. And one of my favorite things about visiting architects' offices are the models. And we've got some models here. And it looks like downtown scapes and surrounding different buildings your firm is involved with?
Yeah, mostly in New York. So we 3D print our cityscape models. And then our process is that we start with blue foam models that we can quickly create for zoning and massing purposes to start to understand what it looks like in the overall cityscape. Once the design starts to be narrowed down, then we'll start 3D printing some iterations of those smaller models. But it's really important to us that there's an understanding of context. And so it's not just one model that we're printing. It's the full cityscape that is around that model so we understand how it is playing with all the other buildings nearby.
Is that architect's favorite word, context? I think one I hear the most often.
Probably. Yeah.
And what it really means is like not just looking at something in isolation.
Correct.
But just what's around it and how everything affects everything else.
Yeah.
Because you get these arguments about you want a building to look exactly like its neighbors, and you get other arguments to where you want to do something wild and innovative. I guess it depends on who your client is, right?
Depends on who your client is. And, some architects, I think, are more sensitive to the neighborhood and others than others. And so we tend to work in a lot of historic neighborhoods. And so there are regulations around what things can look like, right? And so it's a really kind of interesting, wonderful challenge or opportunity to be able to flex design muscles within those constraints. And we find that it's really fun.
Pumping you up. Okay.
Pumping us up.
Now, what is this made of? This little model I'm holding that you 3D printed, what is it made out of?
It's a powder and glue combination that essentially, if you think about epoxy,
it's not giving off harmful gases like the other glue, is
these
it?
ones are not. No.
Okay, good.
But there are some out there that do, but these ones are pretty safe. So.
And are these? I'm just asking this because I'm sure I'm not going to do this, but if I drop this, do they break? Really?
Yeah, please don't drop it.
Are they like ceramics?
So since it's powder based, it is quite vulnerable.
Yeah.
And if you were to drop it or nick it, it would break. There are others out there that are more plasticized that are stronger, but those tend to be a little bit more toxic and not quite worth it.
Yeah, we're trying to keep the toxins out of here.
Trying to keep it down. Yeah. Actually, our air filtration system has an interesting filter, an interesting strategy in it that in our main duct back in our mechanical room, there's a bipolar ionizer.
Oh, yeah, this sounds like Star Trek.
And it looks like little rockets. Yeah.
Oh, can we go see that?
It's inside a duct, so we can't look at it. But I can show you a photo of what it would look like.
All right.
And that ends up actually, it reorients all of the ions, and it eliminates odors, and it filters particulate, and it's actually a much higher filtration level than a lot of these filters are called MERV, and they have different ratings, and MERV 13 is really, really good rating, means that filter is really dense and catches a lot of stuff before it comes out into the space. And this is even more effective than the MERV 13, which is the really effective filtration filter.
So is this state-of-the-art kind of ion-powered filtration?
Yeah, that's why we got really excited about it and put it in our office. Yeah. And it's noticeable. People come in here and will mention that they don't smell anything, which is an odd comment, but it has been a reoccurring one that has been kind of fascinating for us.
Now, with such pure air, do you have issues like when somebody decides to make microwave popcorn and it just invades the whole office because of all the purity?
We haven't had that. I mean, you'll get some when you're in the kitchen use, but our kitchen and our mechanical room and things that make noise and odors are kind of tucked away back where there's kind of higher filtration rates, or higher turnover rates of air, so that it doesn't dump into the studio space and infiltrate everyone's desk.
Because I know popcorn syndrome is epidemic in a lot of places.
It is an epidemic, but it's not so much here.
That's an architectural term for those of you that don't know, popcorn syndrome.
Popcorn syndrome and context.
So let's go out to this other terrace.
Yep. So as we go through this door, I'll point out this, since it wasn't an occupiable terrace before, this door used to be a window like the others that are alongside it. So we had to drop the sill to allow for the door to be installed. And so that now we aren't crawling through a window to get out to the terrace space, which is what we had to do before.
Wow.
So now we're on the west terrace. This terrace was set up to be more of a meadow and also an extension of our working space. So you asked about where people go to take their phone calls.
Yeah.
A lot of people come out here.
Oh, I bet.
Because there's a neutralization that natural noises create. The wind that's coming up 8th Avenue here on our streetscape tends to cancel out a lot of the car noises and honking and ambulances and all of this. So this ends up being a really wonderful moment of prospect for our employees and refuge.
Now you've got a little, what do we call it, gazebo? Is that the right term for this area with the table and chairs and coverings?
Similar, yeah. We have a trellis was what we've called it because it doesn't fully protect, but it protects from sunlight. We have it outfitted with enough chairs to essentially be able to move a meeting from the indoors out here on a beautiful day. There's electrical and data below the table so that we can set up a projector and computer for presentations.
The outdoor table is wired.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. We wanted to make sure that this was a fully functional workspace in beautiful weather.
Yeah.
And it is used that way, absolutely. You know, we've got our river birches here and this more kind of pastoral landscape for the in-between spaces. And it ends up being a very desired area for people to come out to on a
Do you ever
Sunday.
hear from people in these other buildings around you that call in and say they're jealous of your office?
So I have a funny story about that. Yeah, so we're directly across from the Hearst Tower, which is an icon here in New York. And it's a very interesting perspective of it that's elevational. You know, from the street, you're looking up at it, but here you're looking straight on. And you can see the people working in the building. When the solar eclipse happened and we were all out here with our cereal boxes, you know, staring up, trying to figure out, you know, where the moon shape was going to end up.
How to not go blind, right?
How to not go blind, but also, yeah, exactly. And our whole studio was out here, you know, doing this. And we looked over at the Hearst Tower, and they don't have terrace space. And we saw people with signs with their cell phone number saying, "Invite us over, let us join you." And we did. We called them and invited them over, and they joined us. And yeah, it was a wonderful New York moment.
That's great.
Mm-hmm. And on the east side, the east terrace that we were on earlier, when we started planting that, it was, you know, a work in progress. Things were growing as the seasons turned. This past April, we had a planting day, and one of the residents in the residential tower that is just across the way from us leaned out her window flagged us down, and we were afraid she was going to complain about something, because I feel like that's usually what New Yorkers are doing. And
Right.
so she's flagging us down, getting our attention, and we look over at her and she goes, I just want to tell you how much your terrace has improved my life. Just the view of this turning into a greenscape, watching it evolve over time, seeing a natural element outside of my window. It made such a difference to her, and it was touching that she shared that with us.
Now, when you guys put these terraces in, did you have to go through any special administrative hoops with the city to repurpose them for actual human beings to be on?
No, but we did have to structurally reinforce them. So they weren't originally strong enough to hold people and plants and all of this. That wasn't the original intention. And so they didn't have that much support. So we did end up having to essentially re-roof it. And I won't go into the details of all of it, but it was a pretty intense process of ripping the existing roof off, connecting to the structure of the floor below, and then re-pouring a slab, re-roofing it all so that we could allow people to go out there.
Yeah.
But nothing within the city. You don't see up to the terrace. You don't really see anything up here from the street. And so there weren't regulations. We did have to file with the Department of Buildings and all of this for the work, but there weren't restrictions that limited what we were able to do up here.
Are a lot of the buildings in New York that same way, where you have unusable terraces now?
Yes. So unusable terraces and unusable rooftops. And so we tend to call it the fifth facade of the building, that there's this space on the top of the building that is an opportunity for energy savings, for improved view, like we're talking about with our neighbors here, that there are all of these options that are untapped into that could be highly utilized. So we tend to incorporate on all of our projects here in the city some sort of green roof system. And
with the new buildings, I see that a lot.
With older buildings, they're retrofitting that too. So we do see that because it helps with rainwater runoff. It helps with heating and cooling in the summers and winters. There are benefits to the building to actually have that green roof up there. So we do see that.
That's terrific. What's left to see besides, we can't see the mechanical room with the ion power, but...
you have to use your imagination for that one. So I'll take you over, there's one last thing, into what we call the drawing room, which does have a drafting table.
Okay, there's got to be one, right?
But that's not what I'm going to show you, yes.
All right, good.
So you'll notice as we're walking through the studio over to that drawing room, all of our columns are exposed. Usually you'd see them encased in gypsum, or back in the day it was terracotta for fireproofing purposes.
Or asbestos, right?
Luckily not in this building, but yes, oftentimes. And so we left them exposed because your eye reads through them. The shadow and light play on those columns, they start to disappear in the space. Whereas if they were covered by gypsum or covered by another material, you'd read it as this pillar that is blocking your view. And so the riveted steel sets up this beautiful texture and scale as you're looking through the office space that starts to pick up on some of the daylighting throughout. It also helps younger architects understand how the building was built.
You really don't notice it. You don't notice the columns at all.
They're also painted white like everything else, so it helps.
Sure, it helps, sure. And these are some big steel beams. I mean, these are 100-year-old beams, I guess, from this building.
Yeah, so we've got, they're the riveted steel columns, and then we've got a beam and girder system that's clad in the concrete goulash that I pointed out in the entry area and then skimmed over with plaster. But yeah, it's an interesting, beautiful structural system. So the thing I wanted to show you is actually over here. So in the drawing room, we set this up as more of kind of a residential area. And so we've got smaller scale.
So you can sleep here?
So napping pod? No. Someone will try it someday, I'm sure. But stand right here at this window.
Okay.
And look out at the cityscape. So we are elevated up. We're standing on a platform in this room. We're about 18 inches above the typical floor. You remember we walked up a couple stairs to get here? And so the bottom of the window is only about 4 inches from the ground here. And we have almost a full pane of glass that we're looking out onto 8th Avenue from. And I wanted to point out this sensation of prospect, but also risk. Do you feel a little bit of peril standing this close to this large piece of glass?
But you see, I love heights, so I'm not one of those. I love heights.
So this is, there are a few kind of very specific patterns of biophilic design that we implemented in the design of this space throughout the office. And this moment was very specifically curated for this moment of refuge in this comfortable wing chair that's right next to the window, but prospect and peril, which are actually sensations that your body wants, that your body's constantly trying to understand the extent of its boundaries.
Yes.
And so people...
So after you freak out at the height, you can sit down and relax in the chair.
Yeah, you can have a moment.
Now, this street here, such a great view down the avenue. Do you guys get any parades that come down this route at all?
Not down 8th Avenue, but we do get some that, like the Thanksgiving Day parade, comes down the west side of the park and turns, so you can see the parade balloons come and turn as they're going east to then go down further. So we're near the parade route, close enough to see the balloons, but far enough to stay away from all the crowds.
I would think there would be some sort of parade that would come down through here during the year, but...
We haven't found one yet. But it's still a wonderful perspective of all of the cabs and buses and cars from bird's eye view.
That's gorgeous.
So this is the drafting table that I was telling you about. It actually was a sign maker's table.
This is an old drafting
You can start
table.
to see some of the signage that was
What is this,
tested
about
out.
1800s, late 1800s?
I believe so, late 1800s.
Yeah, so 120, 30 years old, at least.
But it's beautiful.
There's no drafting machine on it, so we're not cheating.
There's no May line and no drafting machine.
No
it's
light.
It's for free hand drawing. Yeah.
That's beautiful. And you've got the little drafting paper on there you can roll out and sketch on something.
We do a lot of hand sketching here. It's how we start the process. So this is a nice escape from a desk to be able to come. This area is able to be used by any of our employees. So we book meetings here. People will come in and sometimes take a phone call. So it's available.
You guys have been awarded for this project, right?
Yeah. So some of our goals, as I mentioned before, were to provide the healthiest working environment for our employees. And we were able to find some certifications that helped us kind of quantify those outcomes and quantify if we met those goals or not. So we received LEED Platinum for this space. And we also were able to achieve WELL Gold, which in a renovation project like this of a building of this era, WELL Gold under V1 was an effort. So
these programs that she's mentioning are like national certifications, accreditations. It's kind of like winning the Emmy or the Golden Globe in a way for sustainability.
It's a stretch, but yeah.
A little bit of a stretch.
It's they're certifications that allow, they come in and they test that what you say you're doing in a sustainable way, that you're actually doing it. So it holds your feet to the fire to actually produce what you say you're producing. And for the LEED certification, it's a significant amount of, documentation and submission and proving the design strategies.
Did they send inspectors to come walk around?
Yeah, for the WELL certification, they do. They come and they monitor your light levels. They test your light levels. They test your acoustic levels. They test your water filtration. And so they come and double check, make sure
sure it's true, right? That must be pretty interesting when they come in and do that.
It is. And, and we did some kind of pre-testing on our own, but you're still nervous. It's, it's a test and they're checking things. And
you're like cramming for the exam.
Well, we did everything that we could to make this as healthy and sustainable as possible. And we followed all the rules and we did it all, but there's still that nervousness of, is something going to happen? Is an ambulance going to go by when they're doing the acoustic test or what's going on? But it all worked out. It all worked out well.
Well, Bethany, thank you for this tour. I hope more architects' offices take your lead in making these places attractive for their employees and clients.
Thank you. It's really not difficult, and so we're happy to provide a space like this for our employees and hopefully help reinforce that it's not hard to do.
Coming up, George talks with Anthony Alofsin, author of the book Wright and New York, The Making of America's Architect. But first, in an adventure we are largely making up, Angela Roll was in the CIA science lab washing beakers from another day of running experiments on converting peanut butter into jet fuel, when suddenly a beaker of the thick brown goo broke, cutting her arm and covering her in highly classified chemicals not even available on eBay. As a warm glow came over her and soft violin theme music began to play from the background, her cuts magically healed. Angela thought it was a fluke and walked home. Which is anything I would do after doing that. As she passed the modernist houses in Holland Hills, magical numbers went through her head. She instantly knew the right market value of each house, and she suddenly realized she had a superhero origin story.
Dun-dun-dun.
As Market Girl.
Market Girl.
Angela could predict modernist sales pricing with laser focus. Although ridiculed by other superheroes who could fly or be invisible or get racist uncles to shut up,
Woke girl.
Angela put her powers to work closing sale after sale after sale. She had already graduated from architecture school, which is a real thing, and instead of going over to the dark side, French colonials, she now advises modernist buyers and sellers and tells them how to win on The Price is Right. Angela Roll is your special agent. Reach her at angelaroll.com. That's ROEHL, or call her at 919-995-0550. Anthony Alofsin is an architect, author, and professor educated at the Memphis Academy of Art, Phillips Academy, the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and Columbia. He is internationally recognized as one of the world's leading authorities on the work of Frank Lloyd Wright and modern architecture in general. He has taught for over 25 years at the University of Texas at Austin. One of his books, Frank Lloyd Wright, Art Collector, was the first publication of Wright's previously unseen collection of German and Austrian art prints. Alofsin is also the author of The Struggle for Modernism, the history of the Harvard Graduate School of Design from its beginnings through the 1960s. We now join George as he talks with Anthony Alofsin inside his apartment in New York. That would be Anthony's apartment. U.S. modernists would like to have access to an apartment in New York, but so far, no one's offered. Despite our promise to be trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. Wait a second. You know, scout stuff, plus Heem's chairs, jazz, and martinis added in. We like to call it the Eagle Scout has landed.
Yes.
Anthony, this is a beautiful apartment. I feel like I've moved up to the east side to this deluxe apartment in the sky.
Well, this is an Art Deco building designed by Emery Roth in 1926 for Bing & Bing, the development company, and it was part of a complex of buildings called Southgate. As it turned out, by fluke, there's a lot of wonderful modernist architecture in the neighborhood, and it was a place that artists and musicians and composers flocked to. In a way, people thought, oh, it's too far east, but it's actually ideally located. And I discovered during my research that one of the characters in my book, Wright and New York, lived down the street. Alexander Wolcott, the esteemed critic for the New Yorker magazine, he was a resident of what we call the Garbo building, just at the end of the block. So it's a kind of historic neighborhood, but Philip Johnson's guest house for the Rockefellers is down the street.
Oh, really?
William Lescaze's residence is in the neighborhood, and a few other extraordinary modernist gems.
Lescaze's was the first modernist building of record. Is that what they say about it?
They say that. Around the corner, there was another building that actually was completely redone. Lescaze retained the internal structure of his building and used glass block on the front, definitely updated it in a series of row houses that have their own interesting history. So it was quite a mark. He's someone that I think is utterly marvelous.
Now, 1926, that was the real boom time for New York City.
Absolutely. This was the pinnacle of Art Deco, when there are more Art Deco buildings going up in New York than really anywhere in the world, although I maintain it's maybe the first national style in America, because you can find Art Deco pretty much everywhere, from El Paso to Big Spring, Texas, to Portland and so forth. So it was a thriving, exciting moment. And that's the moment that Frank Lloyd Wright comes to New York for his longest stay.
In the 20s?
Yes.
What year did he get here?
Well, I trace all of his movements to and from New York from his first visit in 1909 to sporadic visits in the teens. Then when he comes in 25, seeking refuge from a disastrous situation with his lover, he returns in December of
Was this when he ran off with the gal to Europe?
No, that was earlier, but when he ran off the gal with Europe, they did come to New York in 1909 and stayed at the Plaza Hotel.
Okay.
They weren't here that
long. That was much earlier.
Much earlier. But in 27, Wright spends a good chunk of time here. His sister, Maganel, lives in Greenwich Village. So Wright gets to really know New York in a way that no one ever quite realized. And he also begins to write about New York and develops this sort of strategy of juxtaposing the city as a whipping boy for his idealistic ruralizing attitudes that eventually become Broadacre City. But the fact is, Wright thrived in New York. It welcomed him, and it turned around his career from the doldrums of the mid-20s to set the stage for the glorious years of the 40s and 50s.
How old was he at that time?
He came in when he was 42. Let's see, he was born in 1867, so we can just do the math.
So actually about 60 years old.
That's when, at this protracted trip, he'd met the woman who became his third wife, Olga von Hinsenberg, in 1924. She was 30 years his junior. So they spent time together in New York. She was quite an esoteric and was a member of an exotic cult directed by someone named Georgy Gurdjieff.
Oh, yes, George Gurdjieff, sure.
So she was a principal player in Gurdjieff's outfit and quite an extraordinary dancer and gorgeous beyond belief. And they fell madly in love. Had a child soon thereafter.
That was a daughter, I think?
That was a daughter, Giovanna, yes.
And she lived a long, long time, as I recall.
Yes, she died fairly recently under a different name.
Okay.
Very sad story, really.
Oh, okay. Now, when Wright was here, his reputation turned around, you said. Was that because of certain buildings?
Yes, it was a combination of a series of factors. One was a revival of his deep friendship with Reverend William Norman Guthrie, who was the minister at the church St. Mark's in the Bowery on 2nd Avenue between 10th and 11th. This is what we now call the East Village. Guthrie this is an unsung, important relationship, maybe one of the most important relationships between Wright and a client that existed. So up to now, people have known little about it. Guthrie commissioned Wright to do two extraordinary projects. One was totally utopian, to create a universal church for all religions that would have no pastor, that would have an internal rampway system, sound, light, music, incense, people dancing along the ramps and so forth, a soup kitchen buried underneath the whole thing. It would have been twice as tall as the Eiffel Tower.
Wow.
So this project didn't have a site, didn't have a budget, but it did do something important, which was to confirm in Wright's mind someone's conviction in his utter creativity. They quickly move on to another project to design a residential rental tower for the property of St. Mark's in the Bowery. This becomes a much more realistic venture. It's a plan that has a sort of central core, like a tree trunk, from which the floors would be cantilevered off the trunk. Wright not only saw this as a solution to Guthrie's problem to raise money for the church's avant-garde programs, but he was also proposing it as an alternative to the Art Deco skyscraper and an alternative to the international style buildings that are starting to percolate from Europe to New York and the States.
Okay. Now, Wright was Unitarian, right?
Well, he was never officially in the log of Unity Temple, but fundamentally he was.
So that was his basic belief set.
Yes.
So this idea of this universal spiritual religious structure, I imagine, would have been very appealing for him, particularly if it was that large.
Absolutely appealing, not just because of his Unitarian inclinations, but because Wright believed in archetypes, as did Guthrie. And they both believed that people and culture of what we would now call the third world still retained true sources of spirituality, and that being in contact with them, Swamis, Hindus, Native American chieftains whom Guthrie brought to the church, or for Wright, the Japanese or the Aztec or the Maya or the Chinese, that these were the cultures which had not been tainted and contaminated by the Western tradition. So Wright was always very interested in these third world cultures. And in the teens, this becomes a fundamental motif of his architecture in what I've called his primitivist phase.
Well, the press had been piling on Wright for a long time. Did that turn around? Did they start to give him a boost?
Absolutely. His relationship with the press really went through ups and downs. In 1922, when the Imperial Hotel survived the Great Kanto earthquake, he got a gold star for being the architect who defied nature, because the Imperial Hotel still stood. But within 2 short years, he's a subject of the yellow journalists who follow his every exploit while he's trying to flee his second wife, Miriam Knoll. Both Miriam and Wright play the press for their own benefit, but it's a scandalous venture. It picked up the scandal of 1914 when Mamie Borthwick had been murdered.
Right.
So Wright is really hitting a low point, which I maintain arrives when he's arrested in October of 1926, hiding outside of Minneapolis. And
what was he arrested for? I didn't know this.
He again was with Olga Ivana, his lover, and their child, and the child by her first marriage. They were in hiding from Miriam, who was harassing them. Miriam had sort of instituted a posse. Someone figured out Frank Lloyd Wright was hiding out. They descended. He was arrested and charged with allegedly violating the Mann Act, transporting a minor across state lines for illicit
purposes. Okay.
Of course, the minor is his own daughter. So he was put in jail for 2 nights, as was Olga Ivana. It was a humiliating event. I have a photograph of Wright being busted in my book. But within 4 years, in this experience of New York, Wright is profiled in the New Yorker magazine as America's only living genius. And by that time, the great esteemed architects of New York have welcomed him. They're exhibiting his work. They throw a big party for him in Central Park. He's getting the recognition that he felt that he never had, and it comes from New York.
You know, in this age now, with Instagram particularly, it seemed like that Frank Lloyd Wright would thrive with that. I mean, I can imagine him walking around now with an Instagram feed covering his life and his projects. That's kind of how it was in the old school with the newspapers and magazines and things like that. They covered him all the time.
Absolutely. The wire services, particularly Hearst, were distributing these sources to the smallest newspapers all over the country instantaneously. Headlines from the newspaper in Helena, Montana, for instance, or the Milwaukee Journal or other places. So oddly enough, the currency and the fluidity and the speed with which information travels today had a parallel in the 20s.
I've heard people call newspapers a once-a-day Instagram feed.
Not a bad description.
Because it's changed so much.
It has.
It really has changed. All right. So Wright is back in the saddle. He's doing well. It's the late 20s. What happens next?
The projects, the utopian project for the modern cathedral doesn't get built. And Wright's very frustrated with the Tower for St. Mark's. What occurs is the crash of 1929. He presents his final scheme to the vestry board of the church 4 days after the crash. No one really realizes how devastating
it's going to
be.
Yeah.
So Wright keeps pushing. And what happens is, for all of architecture, Deco, modernist, whatever it is, except for the Empire State Building and Rockefeller Center, architecture hits a wall. It's the wall of the Depression. So it's a troublesome, problematic time for anyone in the building industry, except for Frank Lloyd Wright. Wright's career starts to ascend from this point forward, while other architects are really struggling. He's a figure in the International Style Show of 1932.
With Philip Johnson.
With whom he has conflict, but it all works out in the end. Wright's work is presented. Within a short space of time, he gets the commissions for Falling Water, one of the great modernist buildings of the 20th century.
All time, yeah.
As well as the Johnson Wax Building. In 1938, with this notoriety, or fame, we should say, because let's remember, Falling Water was published even before it was finally concluded. So Wright is very much in currency. He appears on the cover of Time magazine. I think the first architect to appear on the cover of Time magazine in 1938.
Because I recall that there are maybe 5 or 6 architects that have made it to covers, either in Time or perhaps Newsweek. Not very many in that profession have ever made it to the cover of a magazine like that. No,
and the description of Wright that is put forward is in some ways the standard description that we've inherited almost up to today. And the New Yorker, through Alexander Woollcott, set in motion this view of Wright.
Well, when I go and talk with audiences about architecture in general, and they come up and ask questions, I'll sometimes ask them, like, who's your favorite architect? And the majority of them will still say Frank Lloyd Wright. He remains still one of the best-known architects to have ever lived. Why is that?
I think he is the most well-known architect in this country, and maybe globally. It's actually a complicated question. There are extraordinary buildings that he's left us, beginning with the revolution in domestic architecture from the Prairie period. Mm-hmm. The Usonian homes that he started doing in the late 30s and which flourished in the 1940s become very important as sources for inspiration for mid-century modern. They don't replace mid-century modern, but all of those young practitioners are looking at Wright's work. He produced the Guggenheim Museum, which has just gone on the World Monument list. And he's also created a persona that seems to fit very well with the celebrity and star architecture culture of the late 20th and 21st century. He promoted himself. He lived to be almost 92 years old. He had extraordinary charisma. He knew how to work the media. And that combination of factors, and also that he wrote prolifically, contributed to, I think, the overall force and power of the legacy that we've inherited today, and his familiarity, even his notoriety.
Was he writing mostly books or articles?
He wrote a variety of kinds of work. His most important book was his own autobiography, again published in 1932. It came out of a connection that his literary agent in New York obtained for him from the distinguished firm Longman Green. That book drew young people to Wright because of its candor and its openness and its honesty. And it's those young people who formed the core of the Taliesin Fellowship, which was also founded finally in 1932. He wrote essays. He followed very critically what people wrote about him. He funneled his work between America and Europe, so that European publications, as I trace in my book, became an important conduit, not just for the spread of his ideas in Europe, but the back and forth between America and Europe. So editors in New York would see publications in Europe, see photographs that had never been published here. They would write, we want to publish these. So Wright is constantly feeding the media, monitoring the media, and contributing. He lectured extensively. He wrote essays of various lengths. He wrote experimental pieces. In the period from, say, 26 to 1930, I think I counted that he'd written 100 manuscripts.
And then the 50s come along, and he's on TV.
Yes.
Most notably, the Mike Wallace interview with Wright, and I think he was on What's My Line one time.
He was on What's My Line, yes. And the Mike Wallace interview is in 2 parts. It's really quite extraordinary. Wright is so clever and sharp, and it's very amusing, too. That's one thing people don't grasp about Wright, and it's one of the things that's motivated me is to create a more balanced understanding of the persona. You mentioned at the outset that your podcast, your endeavor is to talk about architecture in ways that everybody can understand.
Yes.
And that's how my writing has evolved over the last 30 years, that I no longer write stiff academic books, although my work is very carefully sourced and scholarly and intensively researched. My audience is the general public. And one of the reasons I do that is I'm concerned that there's such a sensationalist portrait, which is frequently painted and repainted of Frank Lloyd Wright. So we get this figure who's almost a caricature, in fact, is a caricature, but so large that it's hard to ignore. The problem is, in this emphasis on biography, the essence of his architecture and the creativity and the potential of his architecture for the future is lost in the discussion.
Well, wasn't he really? I mean, he was kind of a bad boy. He was the bad boy of architecture.
Well, that's the persona that is put forward.
Okay.
In some ways, he cultivated that, but not to his benefit. I think it was to his disadvantage that he perpetuated that. It doesn't show a mark of maturity or the mark of deep self-confidence. People who want to draw attention to themselves are the ones who have some embedded insecurity. So Wright was a bad boy, and he did misbehave, but lots of people did. So what? And he was also capable of immense kindness, tenderness, generosity, sensitivity. He was a large personality, could be volatile. One could say the same kinds of things about Picasso.
Please do.
Well, I think again, I'm an architect and I'm an art historian, and I want to look at the long view of things. When I think about Frank Lloyd Wright, I ask myself, what cultural figures are comparable to Wright in the 20th century? And the two names that come to mind are Le Corbusier and Picasso. Both lived fairly long, Picasso longer than Le Corbusier, both immensely creative in a whole variety of media, both had large personalities, both were determined to pursue their art, and all these factors apply to Wright. So when I think about the 20th century, 100 years from now, how people will write about it, I think that Picasso and Wright are comparable figures in terms of the variety of their oeuvre and their utter productivity and that creative demiurge pushing both of them onward.
So if Wright had not been such an arrogant person, say, particularly late in his life in the 50s, would he have done better? Would he have been more successful?
It's possible, because he did not make it easy to understand his design process. What happened was a kind of split, that the people who really understood the design process, even from early on, like Walter Burley Griffin, or later someone like Harwell Harris, or John Lautner, or Neutra and Schindler, when they went on their own, Wright had tremendous, except for Harris, Wright didn't feel this way about him, but Wright had great animosity because he knew they understood his design method and they could use it to immense advantage.
So they were taking the palace secrets in a way.
They were taking the design process that Wright had perfected, which he'd learned from someone else too. Wright, his closest followers, and I don't want to be unkind, copied the imagery and the iconography and the look of Wright's work, often without understanding its fundamentals.
Inside Taliesin, the movement survived after 1959, and a bunch of houses and other buildings got completed that were started before his death. I know that there's a difference of opinion between Wright fans and followers on what constitutes a real Wright house. Was it one that Wright designed and saw through to completion? Is it one that he just sort of sketched out a little bit and then handed to fellows? Or is it one that was commissioned before his death but maybe completed 10 years later? Where do you draw that line about what is a real Wright building?
Well, I know people get all worked up about this question and exercised on the subject. Honestly, it doesn't interest me a great deal, because if we took that question, let's go back to painting or the visual arts again and take Picasso. What's a real Picasso? The ones that he did by his own hand, an idea he had that one of his assistants finished after he died, a half-finished work that someone else finished. There's a sort of gradation of authority. There's no doubt about it that some of the projects that were completed after Wright died by his successors are inferior in quality to the kind of work that he did. But we have to remember, by the age of 91, he was nearly 92 when he died, that Wright has a machine operating very efficiently, as many architects do who have large offices, so that there are a number of people collaborating in the creative realization of a design, and Wright's role sometimes is just to oversee the work, which he did with great care and attention. I think the most legitimate works are the ones in which he was most involved.
In your book, you work a lot to humanize Frank Lloyd Wright and help us understand the man behind all the different buildings. What are some of the aspects of Wright that we don't know about as a general public?
Well, I mentioned that he had a sense of humor and incredible wit that is remarkable and really admirable. Even after the hardest moments of his life, this ability to return to a sort of good word or a leitmotif or some joyousness or something quite amusing is really admirable. And I remember when I was young and in the 60s and I read this Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse, I grasped that the essence of spiritual involvement, spiritual evolution, has to do with humor. And if you can't laugh, if you lose your sense of humor, you've lost something. But to have a sense of humor in the midst of tragedy or as you witness tragedy is extraordinary. I mean, look at the way the Dalai Lama is constantly smiling, a man whose whole kingdom has been lost and will never return. So Wright had a capacity for joy and humor and wit, very funny. He could have a very sharp tongue, and he at times was more supportive and involved with some of his children than we realized. He had a long, complex relationship with his oldest son, Lloyd, that I don't think we've really fully come to terms with. There's some good books on Lloyd. I think he was very talented as an architect and
He was.
designer.
We have documented most all of his houses on our website.
So but when I read the correspondence between them, and that's my main tool for my writing and research is the correspondence that exists.
This is all at Columbia now?
All at Columbia, all the originals. And I edited the index to all of Wright's letters, which completely revolutionized scholarship on Frank Lloyd Wright.
Oh, I bet.
I'm just touched by the intimacy and the complexity of that relationship. And as in reality, when we're talking about family and intimate human interactions, these are complex stories. They aren't easily reduced to simple answers. So he had more rapport with his own family over time than we realize. The sense of humor that I mentioned.
Where do we find the humor of Frank Lloyd Wright? Because I've only seen it kind of ironically, like in the Mike Wallace interviews, he comes off as a little funny, but it's only because he's being so out there with his ego.
Well, in my book, I tried to capture some of these quotes. There was a wonderful one in an exchange with Henry Russell Hitchcock, the co-director with Alfred Barr and Philip Johnson of the International Style Show. Hitchcock was a young guy in his 20s when he wrote his first review on Wright, published in France, in French, and it excoriated Wright for using ornament. Hitchcock had never seen any of Wright's work. So it was a bit of a reach. And Wright got hold of this review and figured out what it said and wrote Hitchcock a letter objecting. And in the letter, he said, towards the end, he said, if I had my druthers, I'd turn you out and hang you as a traitor to the American cause. But since that can't happen, let's be friends instead.
That's good.
And they became friends. And Hitchcock became a very important promoter and figure in Wright's work for the next several decades.
Here in 2019, who do you see as the next Frank Lloyd Wright? Who's coming along the pike that's going to dominate American architecture or world architecture in the next 20, 30 years?
I don't think there is such a figure because the combination of factors that wove themselves together to make a protean giant like Wright are just not present even among the star architects who are most emulated today. Philip Johnson said Frank Gehry was the most important architect of the 20th century, but what's Frank Gehry written? And over time, when we look historically back at Frank Gehry's work, how will the buildings after the Guggenheim in Bilbao stack up against it? Will they be a kind of coda or an afterthought? And with that, the peak and the historical moment of his work. There's a lot of competition in contemporary architecture through media and so forth. And the economic times are changing. Patronage is changing. There's so much flux. it's very hard for one single figure to dominate. And Wright did not dominate. Let's be clear. Wright loses the battle for what the American style will be in the second half of the 20th century. It's not Wright's architecture.
No, it's not.
It's the international style, at least in the civic and corporate world.
It's led more by the Skidmore, Owings, Merrill, HOK kind of companies.
Absolutely.
Well, Anthony, this has been really fun talking with you. Thank you so much for inviting me here and letting me see your place.
Well, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak with you.
Thanks for listening. I'm Tom Guild. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. Recorded at Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Guest research by C.S., not her real initials, and enigma to some, feared by others. Visit usmodernist.org's massive modernist archives to hear past shows, discover 7,000 mid-century houses, and access 2.7 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. Plus, you can get on our newsletter list for exciting modernist tours. Contact George at george@usmodernist.org or on Instagram at mr.modernism. George and I'll be back soon with another walk and talk edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.